MOTS-c is one of the most exciting peptides we have right now, being studied for exercise, metabolism, and energy. But calling it exercise in a bottle jumps from promising science to a human result we don't really have yet. My name is Al-Najaar. I'm a medical doctor specializing in men's hormones, fertility, and performance, and I've worked with thousands of men over the years. And if you're looking at MOTS-c, you probably want more energy, easier fat loss, or better training without giving up muscle. But here's what matters. First, I'm going to show you why researchers are even excited about this. Your own MOTS-c rises with exercise, and mice given MOTS-c had better glucose control, lesser weight gain, and greater physical capability. Then we'll tackle the question that matters if you lift. Could the way MOTS-c activates AMPK work against mTOR, which is the signal in building muscle? Watch until the end because those findings point in different directions when you look at them alone. I'm going to put them in the right order, show you where the human evidence stops, and then we'll talk about what the FDA actually decided on a few days ago in their meeting. Because without the full picture, it's easy to turn a peptide into a research claim that doesn't have that backing yet. Now, obviously, this video is only for educational and informational purposes. This is not medical advice. Even though I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor, and this is only a YouTube video. So please don't change anything just based on this. I just like to take these points that a lot of people are talking about on X, on Reddit, and so on, to give you proper information about what's actually behind the science. And my position is actually pretty positive, because the early science is fascinating and MOTS-c deserves serious research. And if you want to understand this even better, you can download my free peptide overview guide. It's going to be the first link in the description to understand this even better while watching this video. That's going to help you separate what we think the peptide will do, what has happened in animals, what we think happens in humans, and what still needs an answer. Now, just one warning before we jump into what MOTS-c actually is. There's going to be a lot of talk about AMPK, mTOR, and if you don't understand what that is, that's fine. I'm going to keep this at a basic level and try to explain it as good as possible using visual analogies as well. Now let's have a look at the screen. MOTS-c is a small signal being sent from inside of your mitochondria. And these are the parts of your cells that help with energy. You can think of mitochondria as the engine rooms in your cells. They produce energy, but they also send signals when the cell is under stress. And MOTS-c seems to be one of those signals. And then we have AMPK, which is a low fuel alarm for your body. When energy runs low inside of your cells, AMPK tells the cells to conserve fuel and restore balance. Now, exercise also triggers some of these stress signals. And that's why exercise in a bottle sounds so appealing. But having one alarm does not equal a whole workout, because exercise consists of load, energy demand, mechanical tension, and adaptation. And exercise influences your heart, your bones, your muscles, your brain, and the skills involved in movement. And so MOTS-c may influence one part of that response, but it doesn't recreate the whole exercise event. Now, the research is very exciting because in 2021, they did a study with 10 healthy young men. They completed high-intensity cycling, and then they measured that MOTS-c actually increased inside of their own bodies. This increased in muscle, and then afterwards went into the bloodstream. And so this matters because this actually connects MOTS-c to actual human biology. And so the body appears to treat this as part of the response to physical stress. Then we have a separate study that contained 30 adults across 3 groups, where we saw that the short-term signal actually depended on the type of exercise that these men did. They either did endurance exercise, resistance exercise, so strength training, or no exercise. And they found that with endurance exercise, it actually trended towards an increase in MOTS-c in the bloodstream. But resistance exercise, so again, strength training, did not create that same signal. And so this is why we say that the response may depend on the type of exercise that a man does. But then came these studies they did on mice, because here they found that these mice who were given MOTS-c actually had an improved glucose control, they gained less weight when they tried to overfeed them, and they had greater physical capacity. They showed this by treating old mice and comparing them to untreated old mice as well, and the old mice ran twice as long and more than twice as far as the untreated mice. And those are meaningful animal results. You have to understand the way we do research in the medical space is we always test on mice usually first. And this is why these results actually support more research into the metabolic effects, age-related physical decline, and exercise. And now that research actually moved forward to a human phase 2 trial. This is currently undergoing, and they have included 120 adults where they are comparing 12 weeks of MOTS-c with placebo. And the main question here is whether MOTS-c actually improves these people's insulin resistance. And maybe you know this already, but insulin resistance is the biggest driver of metabolic disease such as diabetes, heart disease, some non-alcoholic fatty liver diseases, and even some type of cancers. And so if they can find that MOTS-c actually improves insulin resistance, then that's a great signal. Now, before we get to muscle growth, we need a simple map because a lot of peptide videos get very advanced very quickly when they try to answer 4 different questions at once. First, what happens in cells? MOTS-c affects systems that are connected to energy and metabolism. Second, what happens when mice are given MOTS-c? This is where we've seen some of these exciting metabolic and physical effects. Third, what happens to the MOTS-c in people who are exercising? And what we can say is that it changes. And fourth, what happens when you give people MOTS-c? And this is actually the question that we're looking for, that we're waiting for example, from this phase 2 trial. And that fourth box is still open. And so this is why MOTS-c really belong in that short list of peptides that are worth looking for. But we have to remember, it's still too early to say that MOTS-c actually improves fat loss, daily energy, recovery, or athletic performances. And not knowing that is actually fine. It just tells us where the research has to go so we can get an answer. And exactly that leads us to the biggest controversy around MOTS-c and exercise. Because could MOTS-c actually work against building muscle? Because from what we know, does that mean that MOTS-c actually helps with endurance, but it also hinders muscle growth? Let's take a step back and look at the biology. MOTS-c can activate AMPK, which is that low energy stress signal from the cells. And then we have mTOR, which is one of the body's main building signals for muscle. And so some people argue that using MOTS-c around resistance training actually hinders muscle growth. And that could make sense on paper, but we have to be honest, that hasn't been proven in a human trial at all. Because you should think about AMPK and mTOR as light signals that change throughout the day. They're not one switch where if you turn one off, you have to turn the other on, and vice versa. The activity changes with the type of training, the type of activity, your energy state, food, and time of day. Because resistance training, so strength training, again, can actually increase AMPK itself. And everyone knows that doing resistance training, if you eat enough protein, will build muscle mass. In one human study, they showed that muscle building activity, so resistance training, AMPK actually fell during the work, but then it rose afterwards. And so that same workout contained an energy phase that was low, and then a subsequent building phase. In another experiment, trained men completed hard cycling before doing strength training. AMPK increased, but the later muscle building signals after the lifting was not blocked. And so here's the verdict. There is no direct human trial showing that giving MOTS-c blocks muscle growth. But there also isn't a study showing that if you give it, it's going to improve the muscle growth either. So the whole AMPK versus mTOR is interesting, but there still needs to be more research done for us to get a proper picture of what's actually going on in those cells. And so if someone tells you not to take MOTS-c on the day you exercise, that's something that's coming from that person and not from direct MOTS-c data. Now, picture this man. He's 44 years old. He works out 4 days a week. He sleeps 5.5 hours. He crashes at 3 p.m. after lunch every single day. And then he's put on 8 kilos of weight around his waist. And he has saved videos on testosterone therapy, thyroid, sleep trackers, GLP-1 drugs, and maybe even mitochondrial peptides like MOTS-c. And maybe he's also found something called SS31, which is another mitochondrial peptide. If you want me to do a breakdown of that, let me know in the comments below. But now he's heard about MOTS-c, and it sounds like the elegant answer to his problems. Because he wants more energy, he wants fat loss, and he wants exercise in one molecule. But to be honest, this is not a MOTS-c deficiency, because his bottleneck is actually something else. And that's what we have to figure out. If you've watched my videos before this, you know I always talk about exercise, diet, sleep, and stress management, and having that on point, having that foundation on point before you look into more advanced tools like MOTS-c. Because his afternoon crash at 3 p.m. could be due to sleep debt or sleep apnea. It could be his calorie intake, his glucose intake, his medication, his training load or lack of training load, his hormones, or all of those together. And so if he just chooses an advanced peptide like MOTS-c before figuring out what his bottleneck actually is, he's just adding another variable on top, which is only going to make his life harder. But that doesn't mean that MOTS-c is a bad idea. I'm just saying, get your foundation in place first. Then, if you want to and you have someone who's helping you do this, have one clear outcome of what you want to actually achieve, but also a reason why this comes before something else. And that sequencing is exactly what my program, Performance Rebuild, is designed to do. Because we're going to map the whole picture, choose our useful measurements, act on the first bottleneck, and then we're going to review the status and what's going on before we add something on top of that. And so if your issue is bigger than just one peptide and you really want your health back, you can look in the description for a link for my program. It's a 6-month mentorship with me personally. But I have to be honest, it's usually for guys who have more money than they have time. But if it sounds interesting and you really want to reclaim your health, to feel strong, get more energy, maybe even improve your sex drive, have a link in the description below. But now let me give you the 4 questions I would ask before adding MOTS-c. The first one is, what exact outcome is promised? Is it more energy, lower body fat, greater endurance, or is it slower aging? Because those are different claims. And just because there's evidence for one, it doesn't mean that there's evidence for the rest. Question 2 is, what type of evidence supports that exact outcome? And like we've talked about, a cell study can show something, a mouse study can show something, but if the human study doesn't show that same thing, such as improved insulin resistance or improved endurance, then it doesn't really make sense. Question 3 is then, was this measured in someone like you? Because the current phase 2 trial that's running is in adult obese men with prediabetes. And that means that it might not work for someone who's actually healthy and has his foundation on point. Question 4 then is, what else could explain that problem? Because low energy and poor body composition, they're not diagnoses. Before you start injecting yourself with peptides or powder you've gotten from a magical website, maybe you should look into what bottleneck is actually holding you back from improving your energy or dropping weight. So again, overall, I'm very excited. I'm very positive about this peptide. But remember, it doesn't mean that just because it worked for someone else, that is going to work for you. And while we're at it, let's talk about what the FDA actually said about MOTS-c itself a few weeks ago. Because in July, there was an advisory vote where there were 7 against 5 that recommended that 2 types of MOTS-c could be added to a list of ingredients that pharmacies could use to compound drugs. It didn't approve MOTS-c, it didn't show that MOTS-c actually works, even though it might do, but it was advice to the FDA, not the FDA's final answer. Because FDA staff, for whatever reasons they have, were cautious, right? They were talking about quality, safety, and effectiveness that they said wasn't established. And so again, it hasn't been approved by the FDA. The final decision is still pending. So, is MOTS-c really exercise in a bottle? My answer is very exciting, but not yet. The positive case is real. MOTS-c is part of human biology, but administering MOTS-c doesn't equal the same gains. Now, with this randomized human study underway, we are looking forward to a lot more new data. And so until that data actually arrives, you should treat exercise in a bottle as a research direction and not a clinical recommendation. Now, if you've watched this and you think you are ready to actually take back your health, your performance, your energy, you want to feel stronger again, you're ready for my Performance Rebuild mentorship, you should check that out in the description. But if not, watch my video on the peptide roadmap. It shows the order that I would take before any advanced compounds enter the conversation at all.